This is Mike Tatarsky, host of the Vietnam Weekly podcast, coming to you from Ho Chi Minh City. For obvious reasons, Vietnam isn't exactly synonymous with the strong collection and sharing of public opinion. While social media platforms like Facebook and YouTube are far more freewheeling than what you would see in China, they're monitored to some extent, and average folks can get in trouble for what they post. There's more leeway than some international observers may realize, but you certainly won't see the fire hose of extremely strong opinions directed at government leaders, for example, that you'd see in a place like the United States. But that doesn't mean people don't have opinions, and it's vital to gauge them in a thorough way. That is precisely what the Vietnam Provincial Governance and Public Administration Performance Index, or PAPI for short, has been doing for 15 years. Every year, it assesses opinions across 8 dimensions meant to measure the direct impact that government policies have on the public. It is, quote, the country's largest annual citizen-centric and nationwide policy monitoring tool, according to the report, jointly conducted by the United Nations Development Program, Real-Time Analytics, and the Center for Community Support and Development Studies. The 2023 index included inputs from nearly 20,000 residents nationwide. I wrote about the latest PAPI back in April when it was released, but it's absolutely worth revisiting in greater detail. This can be considered a sister episode to my previous show about the Provincial Competitiveness Index, which surveys the Vietnamese business sector's assessment of public policies. Today's guests are Eddie Mielewski, who joined me for that episode as well, a professor of political economy at Duke University, and Paul Schuler, an associate professor of political science at the University of Arizona. They are 2 of the 5 co-authors of the 2023 PAPI, in addition to being leading experts on politics and governance in Vietnam. We discussed the origins of the PAPI and the need to assess public views on policy, the response over time from different levels of government, its evolution into an elite public opinion survey, the unique nature of the index on a global scale, PAPI's dimensions and which matter most to people, the anti-corruption campaign's reflection through the survey, and insights from the open-ended issue of greatest concern question. As always, if you have any comments, feedback, or guest ideas, get in touch at matatarsky@gmail.com. Let's get to my conversation with Paul and Eddie. Paul, thanks for coming on the podcast, and Eddie, thanks for coming back.
My pleasure. Yeah, wonderful to be here again, Michael. Thank you.
Yeah, so we're talking about another kind of comprehensive report, the PAPI, which is the actual full name is a bit of a mouthful. But whoever wants to go first, if you want to maybe kind of get us started with the background of PAPI, you know, how it got off the ground and what its objectives are.
So I guess I should take this question first because I was around for the origins. I'm old enough to remember them. Paul was still a graduate student, so he's come on later. He's brought a lot of improvements in a whole bunch of ways, but I guess I was there for the origins. So it started in 2008, 2009. We started having these conversations between myself. There was a wonderful governance officer at UNDP at that time named Jairo Acuna Alfaro, Huyen, Do Thi Thanh Huyen, who she worked alongside him. There was a great research group called SOCOTUS that was very influential in our thinking at the time. And then, of course, we were having some conversations with the Fatherland Front. The big issue was the PCI had become quite prominent. As you remember, the PCI, the Provincial Competitiveness Index, had started in 2005, and it was entirely based on surveys of businesses. And it took, as we talked about before, it took a little while for it to be accepted, but once it did, provinces really started to reorient their activities. They started to have special task force that were devoted to improving their PCI scores. But I began to notice, and Jairo and Huyen also began to notice that there was a conflation going on at the time, and I think a completely reasonable conflation between what was good for businesses and what was good governance. And we started to talk about, well, we need a way to sort of alter this impression a little bit, because while businesses and individual citizens might agree on questions of transparency or questions of corruption, they have fundamentally different views about, say, for example, regulation. Businesses would like it to be less regulatory, less stringent. Citizens would value more protection, right? Or think about land. At the time, land continues to be a big issue. Businesses want easier access to land. Citizens, are, especially rural citizens, are worried about the loss of historical agricultural land, or in cities, the loss of communities that are going to development. And so we wanted a way to be able to provide a counterbalance to the PCI in provinces. And we thought, since the PCI had been successful, since people understood the indexing methodology, that a separate index that was aimed at measuring citizens' viewpoints would be a good way to do that. Though, that was the initial idea and onset. Of course, designing the methodology for it was very different, because your ability to reach citizens and your ability to do the type of rigorous research requires a fundamentally different way of approaching the survey and approaching the sampling design. But that was the initial origin and idea of it.
And yeah, I mean, you mentioned, so Eddie referenced our previous episode on the PCI, which if you haven't listened to that yet, I strongly recommend you check that out. But how provincial governments bought into it. I mean, I guess it took a little bit of time, but picked up speed. Have you seen, well, it's been a while now, but was there a similar process with Poppy?
Yeah. And so I think Paul can speak to this a little bit too. I think there has been. I think actually, in an interesting way, it took a little bit longer. I think provincial leaders understood very clearly their roles in being attractive to investment and growing private sector. I think their role in the types of things that Poppy was measuring, so, and we'll talk about that in a little bit, but measuring accountability, participation of citizens were not things that they had adapted their policymaking framework to deal with yet. And then I think second, there was, Poppy, by coming after PCI, did face the challenge that people were like, what is this? We have two different indices. Why aren't they perfectly correlated? Why is this province better on Poppy than PCI? And that created some confusion that we had to address. And I think the third one is, the third issue just is, Poppy at its core, and I think it what has always been, but it has really manifested more into this over time. Poppy is a very, very sophisticated public opinion survey, that has the type of rigorous methodology that you would see in an elite survey, public opinion survey in the United States, or even, I would say, in some places more rigorous. And I think that part of Poppy has it sometimes been, thrown up some challenges, both for provincial and national leaders. Paul, you want to add to that?
Yeah, you see different constituencies being served a little bit by PAPI as well as the PCI. So, I've been able to go to both PCI and participated in the PAPI launches, but visited some of the PCI launches, and it's a very different vibe at the two launches, and it reflects sort of the different communities that are involved to some degree, which isn't to say there's some overlap. I think businesses are still concerned with governance being good for citizens and making sure citizens are happy with the way that land is being requisitioned to make their jobs easier. But you see, for instance, the Ministry of Social Affairs, people involved in that, e-governance issues. You see people that are involved with e-governance, land rights protections, people at the central and local levels that are dealing with those issues, different issues that are attending the Poppy launches, and people from the civil society related types of organizations. Maybe we won't call them civil society organizations, but groups dealing with protection for people with disabilities, women's rights. Those types of issues tend to be more prominent at some of the PAPI launches, which sort of relates to one other difficulty that PAPI has, which is PAPI is getting the viewpoints of a much more heterogeneous population. It's getting the perspective of all citizens, whereas PCI just has to reflect the opinions of the business community, which is certainly important, but it's a much more homogeneous community. And so reflecting their viewpoints more accurately is easier when you have less variation in the viewpoints of the people that you're targeting. And so Pappy does have some issues with, you just have lots of very diverse people with lots of different perspectives, which means that accurately pinpointing their range of views within a margin of error can be a little bit more challenging than it can be with something that's supposed to represent a smaller, not smaller, but narrower group of people.
That's really interesting. And I do want to get to the methodology in a minute, but I guess, so Eddie, you kind of mentioned how it's now, Pappy is like this elite level public opinion source. And I guess I kind of want to just kind of drive that point home, maybe for people who aren't 100% familiar with Vietnam. Like, that's exceptionally rare here, given the system of governance. There's not exactly Gallup polls here. Obviously there's a U.S. presidential election coming up, and there's all kind of polling going on. That doesn't happen here. So how unique kind of is this in what it does?
Yeah, I mean, there are, of course, there are public opinion polls, and there's very, very big firms that do marketing surveys, and they're the youth, the sociological youth survey is also very good. But I think what Pappy is doing, I think in any country, anywhere, what Pappy does every year is staggering. I just want to make that clear. So Pappy is surveying over 14,000 Vietnamese citizens, including a large migrant population, almost 1,000, that we have to identify not in the province for which they're officially registered, right? And then where they have a household registration certificate, so that we can get migrant views as well. It is designed to be nationally representative, but then we also use a staged sampling strategy where we sample at the province level, at the district level, and the commune level, so that we can draw representative samples at all those levels. That is, if we wanted to pull out, we can demonstrate, we can compare communes to each other or compare districts to each other. And then it covers a wide range of experiences, citizens' experiences in Vietnamese elections, citizens' experiences with grassroots democracy, citizens' experiences with communal budgeting, as well as citizens' experiences with administrative procedures and infrastructure and more e-governance. So it's a real thermometer measuring how citizens are experiencing governance. And as I said, like, the reason, we brought things into the survey that were new to the Vietnamese survey experience. So we're using probability proportional to size to sample units. And I can explain a little bit, if you want, Michael, a little bit about some of the choices we make in the methodology, but we're also using pretty sophisticated set of survey weights to deal with, matching back our population back to the census to make sure that it's representative at most levels, and also to deal with some non-response bias. The amount of non-response bias we have is actually quite low, both sort of in comparison. We usually have, like, Paul, correct me if I'm wrong here, but about 80% response rates. So we actually do pretty well on response rates relative to other public opinion surveys. So, and I just want to say it's a beast, right? Because we train dozens of research managers and hundreds of researchers who go out all over the country to be able to do these surveys in person. So unlike the PCI, which is a mail out and now online survey, Pappy is done in person with tablets. So that allows us to reach the most rural of communities, allows us to bring in people who may not have perfect literacy. So it really is capturing every element of Vietnamese society, which Paul says has problems in terms of heterogeneity, but I think is great in terms of being able to, disentangle real policy problems in Vietnam.
Yeah, I definitely didn't intend to dismiss any, market research or other surveys, which I do see and are super interesting. But certainly in terms of, so there's I'll read out the 8 dimensions, overarching dimensions that Pappy covers. We won't get into all of them, but there's participation at local levels, transparency of local decision-making, vertical accountability towards citizens, control of corruption in the public sector, public administrative procedures, public service delivery, environmental governance, and finally e-governance. How were those decided upon? And I'll just let you go from there.
Yeah, so I'll start. I'll take this one too, because goes back to the origins, and I think
Sure.
Paul can. Yeah. So the first six that you mentioned: participation, transparency, accountability, corruption, control of corruption, administrative procedures, and service delivery. Those were the original six, and those we had for most of Poppy's history. The environment and e-governance have only been added recently to deal with to just sort of to stay up with changes and new issues that the Vietnamese government is dealing with now. And those weren't big issues when we started Poppy, and so they weren't part of it. The two ones that we really wanted to capture when we started this were the first one, which is on participation, because at that time, the grassroots democracy decree had been in place for a little while, the first grassroots democracy decree. And so there were all these interesting changes going on in village elections, in commune elections, and even some changes making participation in national elections more interesting. And we wanted to provide a framework for that as a way of sort of gauging and incentivizing citizen participation in the decisions that affect their lives. And so that first index was the original one. The second one, the second one that was really critically important, was the administrative procedures one, which was subindex 5, because at that time, there had been a big effort in Vietnam. There had been this effort called Project 30 that was a sort of a special project of Nguyen Thanh Duong, who was the prime minister at the time, to streamline administrative procedures. And that was not supposed to just happen for businesses. It was supposed to happen for citizens. And since that was a really sort of crucial part of a whole bunch of things that would follow in Vietnam, cadre sort of performance evaluations. So we wanted to capture that. And then we added the others on because these were sort of, standard measures of governance that the international community, especially UNDP, thought were critically important. So that's how, and we thought those would be nice benchmarks, the accountability, transparency, and corruption measures against what we were already seeing in Poppy. And then service delivery came about because, once again, we were measuring citizens, and we had this opportunity to ask them about things that citizens really care about: education, experience with health and hospitals, and infrastructure. So we decided to take advantage of that opportunity to measure that as well. We didn't think that that's so much as a measure of governance, but we thought it would be useful to put that in there so that local governments could gauge those. As Vietnam's policy changed, as environment has become more important to Vietnamese citizens, and as the Vietnamese government has started to experiment with e-governance, we've added those later. A lot of times because provincial officials were asking for it. So like with PCI, these have become a useful tool for local officials to benchmark their performance against other places. And as their portfolios have become more complex, we've had to adapt the way we measure these things as well.
Paul, do you want to maybe add anything about the later additions to the dimensions?
Well, no, I could just add sort of on the different dimensions. I think one thing Eddie didn't mention, but that he introduced and the team introduced early on, is that in terms of aggregating these indices into the overall governance indicator, it's interesting. There was an emphasis that the research team put together on the indices that they were interested in, but we can also kind of gauge what issues or which dimensions are most important to citizens. And one thing that we do to weight the different dimensions in terms of creating the overall governance indicators is looking at which dimensions correlate most strongly with overall satisfaction with government. And over again, it's the fourth dimension, experiences with corruption, that seems to be the strongest correlate. I think dimension 2, transparency, also tends to correlate fairly strongly with overall satisfaction with governance, and that's been pretty consistent. So it's interesting to see not just of course the different dimensions are important in their own rights, but to see which ones seem to matter most to citizens. There is a little bit of ambiguity there. We do ask the issues that citizens care most about, and similar to the rest of the world, citizens say they care most about the economy, but when it comes to evaluating their own government's performance, corruption and transparency seem to be quite critical as well. So it's not an issue that citizens sort of volunteer open-endedly, but it's something that seems to color their opinions of local governance, which would speak to, why the central government takes it so seriously.
Well, I was going to say, since Paul brought up the corruption dimension, Eddie, when we had our conversation about PCI, sorry, I don't know if you can hear the dogs in the background. Eddie, you mentioned how over time businesses were reporting, paying fewer unofficial charges and setting aside smaller percentages of their revenue to pay these charges. It still happens, but is reducing. I found it was interesting that control of corruption was an improved dimension in the 2023 report. What have you guys seen on that front over the past few years within the context of the anti-corruption campaign?
Yeah, I think it's been interesting there as well. So I just want to add one little point to what Paul was saying. Like, it has been at times that the control of corruption index has because of the weights, because it's weighted to citizen satisfaction, has had 35 to 40% of the weight of the index overall. Like, when we do the index, it's just been really important to citizens. It was not, I think the anti-corruption campaign was not a surprise. Like, when you see a correlation like that, between how citizens view their local governments and the way they experience corruption. Yeah, so we have seen similar levels of change in PAPI on the measures of corruption to what we've seen in PCI, that there is clearly a change in citizens' experiences with petty corruption since 2016 in a negative direction, meaning like in the sense that citizens are more happy. Though, and I think I definitely want to jump in here. The PAPI survey covers so many more different aspects of corruption than the PCI, and so not all of them have trended that way. So like, we have like all of these measures of citizens' experiences with sort of small amounts of informal charges when dealing with administrative procedures. Then we have measures of informal charges they pay in hospitals or schools. Actually, there we see really dramatic improvements. And then we have measures of kind of their views about nepotism and connection, which is sort of loosely connected corruption. Isn't exactly corruption, but citizens sort of experience it and think about it as corruption when it's difficult for them to get jobs in the civil service. And then finally, we have their evaluations of grand corruption, like what they think is going on at higher levels. And the changes have not been exactly in the same direction on all of those. Like, I would say, just generalizing widely, I say that experiences with petty corruption have gone down more, and along with education and hospitals, than the others. I think the others we've seen a little bit more sclerotic answers. Paul, do you want to jump in here?
Yeah, I think that's right. So we ask questions about whether or not the central or provincial governments are serious about dealing with corruption, which I think gets to more of the grand corruption, which is really hard to measure, of course, because citizens in many respects are as aware or unaware as we are. They're in the same boat as us to a large degree in terms of being able to assess whether that's true. And they can experience directly, whether they're paying bribes at hospitals and paying bribes, which of course matters and probably does color their opinion about whether corruption's happening elsewhere. But one interesting question, which we haven't totally got a grip on, but there's work trying to figure this out, is, the anti-corruption campaign can kind of cut two ways in terms of, how citizens perceive grand corruption. On the one hand, they can perceive it as getting better because people are, being held accountable for engaging in corruption. On the other hand, people can see, all these news reports and surmise that maybe there's more than they thought. And what I do think is interesting is that people tend to perceive corruption as worse at the provincial level than at the national level. So that we'll put it a different way. They think that national government is more serious about dealing with it than provincial level governments. And so they do tend to be more critical of provincial and district level governments than they are of the national government. They tend to be very trusting in the national government in terms of dealing with corruption. And that's something we've seen reflected in different surveys. This is also to some degree true in China, where people tend to be critical of the local government more so than the national government. So, exactly what the reason for that is, it's hard to go dig into the data too much more than that, but those are some of the patterns we've seen. But I think it is noteworthy that really since 2016, 2015, since the anti-corruption campaign began, it really has been a steady drop in terms of people's perceptions of petty corruption. I think that's one thing that does map onto the PCI as well. So,
yeah, and I mean that was interesting in our conversation about PCI Eddy, and equally interesting here. I mean, that's the kind of stuff that's can be more difficult to take away from, I guess, domestic or just media coverage generally, because the grand cases do get so much attention. And I mean, this is new insight, but sometimes it can be hard to tell if what's politically motivated, what's not. I mean, they're the ones like the two COVID repatriation flight and the test kit scandals. I get the sense those were, the general public was like, okay, it's good that they they prosecuted those involved in those cases because they directly harmed average people.
Yeah, during the time of crisis, I think like those corruption scandals did not play well because it felt like people were taking advantage of the Vietnamese citizens in the time of crisis.
So what are some other, beyond corruption perceptions, what are some of the other, kind of big notable trends you've seen over time? Maybe let's limit it to like 2 or 3, I suppose.
So I want to talk about when I have this really fun paper with Phan Thuong Ngoc at Fulbright University that so when we first started the Poppy for budget reasons, we were not able to do the entire country, so we randomly assigned some to receive the Poppy score and others to not receive the Poppy score. So we kind of had, and because they were random, we had a comparison group, like which provinces had it and which ones didn't. So we could look over time to see what that head start did in terms of later on the next year. So 2010, we had that random assignment. Then 2011, we could then look. And so it was really interesting. So the interesting thing for me is that the major index, if you like there's been a lot of improvements over time and a lot of changes, but when you compare to the counterfactual provinces that didn't have that head start on the Poppy, the one area where there was the most improvement in the places that got the head start was administrative procedures. And I've always found that really interesting because that was what the central government was prioritizing at the time, as opposed to the other measures like participation and transparency. They really cared about administrative procedures. So it was interesting when that one came about, that one was the one we saw the most improvement. Also, that we also see, talking about informal charges, that group that received the Poppy early also were able to move faster in terms of dealing with corruption a little bit, not as much as administrative procedures. So that's one cool sort of finding that I've taken out of it, was sort of interesting. I'm sure Paul has, I have more, but I'll let Paul jump in with his favorite trends.
Well, I think the one thing that has been interesting to me, we asked this question, an open-ended question on your issue of greatest concern. We've been asking that one since 2015. And that's sort of a standard question that's asked in, around the world in various public opinion surveys. And it's the one kind of open-ended question that we have citizens respond to. Because they can be a little bit more complicated to code. You get more richer information, but they can be more challenging to kind of quantify. But our coders do a really good job of kind of putting them, taking these open-ended responses and putting them into discrete categories. And I think one of the biggest trends that we've seen is poverty reduction has always kind of been the top concern. That's always been kind of surprising for people, particularly given that the poverty rates in Vietnam have really dropped, as everyone knows, in the last 15 to 20 years, less than 15% of the country now. But what's been rising is been just sort of standard economic concerns that we tend to see, in the developed world or other parts of the world where people are concerned about GDP growth, people are concerned about employment. And that's really been increasing every year since 2016, just the steady increase in number of people who are just concerned basically about jobs and employment. And, sort of to some extent, it kind of demystifies Vietnamese public opinion. In many respects, they look a lot like, voters do in other parts of the world. And, it's sort of one other related thing, one thing that we do in PAPI is we kind of get a window into what are the attitudes of citizens, some of the questions that don't actually go in the survey or go on the index. And so we ask about things like support for the death penalty, support for environment, support for LGBTQ politicians, those types of things. And what's interesting there is you find sort of Vietnamese citizens kind of defy the standard groups that we might put people in other countries into. There's people that have some very, what we would call conservative viewpoints in some respects, but then a very kind of liberal, pro-social viewpoints in other respects. So there's very high support for the death penalty, for example, but a lot of pro-social attitudes towards redistribution. Most Vietnamese citizens are very supportive of, paying more in taxes to help people in poverty. So it's some of those other questions that we get to ask are kind of also provide interesting insights into kind of what Vietnamese citizens are like from a more well-rounded perspective that you don't get from a lot of surveys.
So two more that I sort of have been paying attention to. So like, and this, I think this is related to what Paul said, is like, if you look at the measures in the service delivery section in terms of like one, just what share of the population has social insurance or as health insurance, those numbers have just leaped up over time, right? So and health insurance especially, and then when you look at views about the sort of their views about quality of quick care, their views about improvements of infrastructure, those have also leapt up over time. So you do have like some evidence of relative responsiveness in government. Like on the negative side, we like, and this is similar, probably we don't see a lot of improvements on transparency. Once again, I find that kind of interesting because like there's so much effort spent on transparency, but it hasn't seemed, for some reason, there's a mismatch between what's going on in terms of what's put on websites and what citizens know and have access to. And that shows up in the e-governance measures too. That sort of mystifies me a little bit. And then one thing we spent a few reports tracking, which Paul has been studying pretty intimately, is the land issues. There's we've seen all sorts of complications about citizens' views of land and whether if they feel that they're appropriately compensated if land has been taken from them. And I think we have not seen. I would not characterize those as trends in a positive direction. Do you want to jump in on that, Paul?
Well, I guess on the land issue, that is actually one of the things that PAPI does really well. Is there are lots of policies that happen at the central level, and there's a school of thought among some Vietnamese academics that the state's policies don't matter at all, and they never actually get implemented, and nothing ever happens as a result of state policies. Not Vietnamese academics, but academics that study Vietnam. Necessarily, but and that's sometimes the case. There are a lot of policies that are passed, and many of them probably aren't implemented and have much of an impact. But then some of them do seem to. And the 2013 land law revision is kind of one of those where we saw a pretty sharp decrease right after the land law was revised, and the number of people saying that they had their land seized. So that land law did have a number of increasing restrictions that were put on governments, additional procedures they had to go through in order to take land and redevelop it for different purposes. And PAPI was able to pick that up. I mean, it dropped from 5 to 6% of the population saying they were having their land taken to less than 3%, and it's been now less than 3%. This is residential land, not necessarily farming land, but that was a change that we did see. On the positive end, assuming that we think, people, not getting their land seized is a good thing. But on the other side, we did ask some interesting questions about the mismatch between what's the market price for land versus what's the price that land is taken from citizens, what's the land price that the government pays. And there it was really fascinating when we randomized whether we asked about the official price or the market price. There was a big mismatch between what citizens said the market price was versus what the official price was. And so there is still a lot of issues with compensation for those people who are having their land taken. So on the one hand, we see some positive improvements, and on the other hand, certainly still a lot of areas where you can understand why there might be some tensions with regard to land in the country.
Yeah, I mean, land is kind of endlessly fascinating, and I mean, especially in urban areas like Ho Chi Minh City, kind of any project that is delayed, which is a lot right now. One of the primary causes is always compensation, just the procedures and the cost of moving people. And as you said, Paul, you don't want to advocate for people getting kicked out of their homes or anything like that. But when they're trying to build metro lines or bridges and they have to move hundreds of households, it's very slow. And the pricing, I mean, I remember years ago I talked to Eric Harms, who's a great Vietnam academic who wrote about Phu My Hung and Thu Thiem here in Ho Chi Minh City, and how they developed Phu My Hung first, and then people living in Thu Thiem were kind of like realized how much money they could potentially get for this land, and then started, I may be simplifying it, but realized what it was worth, and that they weren't being offered what they felt it was worth. So always interesting with land.
No, Eric's work on that is really great, and I think that's sort of generally true. Like when the first compensation, so there, part of maybe what we're picking up is a realization expectations. When people were coming with compensation early on, it sounded great, but now as you see the market price rise so much more than you were compensated or what you could achieve with your compensation, that's changed your views about it. So that, I mean, it's good that Vietnamese citizens are becoming more sophisticated about that.
Yeah. And Eddie, I mean, you mentioned the kind of lack of progress on some transparency, which I pulled up. I wrote a newsletter edition about the PAPI when it came out in April. And I also noted the report noting the kind of lack of transparency with poverty lists, and then also commune budgets. So, I mean, that commune is like, I think the lowest administrative or the smallest administrative level. So this is like very local.
Lowest official one, because there is a village governance level as well.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
So the hierarchy commune's the lowest, but citizens also do have a village head, which is also an elected position that has some responsibilities as well.
I know it's hard to get into the head of like a commune leader per se, but why do you think kind of these areas have remained there? Why do you think there hasn't been much progress here?
I'm puzzled by it because I see them actually doing things to try and be more transparent. Like I see the budgets being posted. I see them trying to inform people about poverty lists. So I'm actually, I don't totally understand the gap between what's actually happening on the ground and what citizens are experiencing. I don't actually, it's obviously maybe there are concerns about being able to look too closely at these measures, and there might be issues about capacity, but I think there's something more fundamental going on about how citizens learn about what their local governments are doing. Because we see the same trend in the PCI as well, and the reason, what we're doing is we're like literally asking citizens, do you know where land maps are? Do you know who's on the poverty list? If you needed them, could you figure out where to go? And what we're getting is answers that they don't know, and they don't know where to go to get them. I mean, that's simplifying greatly, because there are a lot of citizens that do, but that's sort of it. Paul, what are your thoughts on it?
I mean, with the poverty list in particular, I think some of this correlates a bit with COVID, which is another sort of interesting topic in and of itself, and how that's kind of impacted governance. But with COVID, there was a lot more. There were government compensation packages that were supposed to be targeting people that were adversely affected by COVID. We did find that, can't remember the exact figure, but upwards of 25% to 50% of the population had at least experienced some income shock due to COVID. And of course, you remember all the stories about, how much dislocation COVID caused, particularly in, the Ho Chi Minh City area. And so a lot more people may have been interacting with government assistance in the last 3 or 4 years, maybe prior than had been in the last 5 to 10 years. And so, one theory, and we have, again, it's a theory. So the data can let us know that, there are these trends. Sometimes one frustration we do have is sometimes we get questions about, why the trends are the way they are, and we need to try to figure them out. But one theory is possibly that, more citizens were previously they might have assumed that the poverty list were working well, or everything was transparent, until they or someone that they knew had to actually interact with it, and maybe they had either a positive or negative experience and were thinking about it more critically. So that's, of course, always a possibility.
So I think it's always important to keep in mind, like, it is a public opinion survey. So like, we're asking citizens what their experiences and opinions are on these issues. So their times are going to be mismatches, right? Or there is learning that goes on among citizens that changes like our interpretation of how we understand the data that's coming in. Like, we're not coming in and objectively scoring localities. Like, we're not visiting every commune to see whether their budget is publicly posted or not, or whether they had an.
I mean, this reminds me of the debate over the Vibe session in the United States, right, where Democrats are convinced that the economy is improving and everyone should be very, very happy, and polls show that they're not. And governance is tricky, because governance, tries to be a little bit more objective, and we try to make the survey more less about public opinion and more about, sort of, as much as we can make it about concrete things. But about experiences. So, rather, do you, instead of saying, do you think corruption is high or low, have you experienced paying a bribe personally? So that, in theory, should be trying to take away some of these perceptions. So for the poverty list in particular, what we ask is, are people that are supposed to be on the list not on the list, and are people that are not supposed to be on the list on the list? And in theory, that's, a bit more objective and not as perception based. But, if people are suddenly paying more attention than they were paying 5 years ago for whatever reason, then their answers to that might change for reasons that don't really have anything to do with the underlying actual accuracy of the list themselves. So, we try to limit it as much as possible, but there is always the possibility that other external events can affect people's perceptions that affect the index.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great point about perceptions. And I mean, you mentioned the Vibe session in the States. Derek Thompson of The Atlantic has done some good podcast episodes on that, where they have these surveys where you ask people, like, how's the economy doing? And they're like, oh, terrible. And they're like, well, how about your personal finances? And they're like, oh, they're fine, which I guess so happens everywhere. And so Paul, you mentioned earlier the open-ended issues of greatest concern question, which I also found fascinating, that I think it was poverty/hunger was cited by 22.4% of respondents, which was by far the biggest topic, which I was also kind of surprised by, given all that economic dynamism here and whatnot. Is that just down to, no matter where you are in the world, you're most worried about having enough money to put food on the table for your family?
Well, so we actually did try to piece this together a couple years ago. So we tried to ask some questions about, what is it that you're most concerned about with regard to poverty? And it was really difficult to pin down, but one of the issues that we sort of strongly linked to concern about poverty, that actually relates to some of the current issues going on in Vietnam right now, is social insurance. So we found that people who had social insurance were much less likely to cite poverty as an important concern. And health insurance has rapidly increased. Health insurance has rocketed to, nearly all the country has health insurance. It's about as prevalent as electricity throughout Vietnam. So well over 90% of the country.
And that's dramatic. It was like 50% or less when we started the Poppy survey, to almost is incredible.
So it's about, 90% now. But social insurance, and by social insurance, I think the most important component is basically retirement, money for, retirement. That's at less than 30% of the population. And for most people who have it, it's people who are required to have it due to, working in the formal sector or working in the government. And so, large amounts of the population don't have the safety net to fall back on. And so, even people who have social insurance now, there's been some issues about whether or not they're going to, take the lump sum. The economy's obviously, been a bit more challenging the last couple of years. But then, this is not taking into account the large numbers of the population that just don't have social insurance whatsoever and rely on various other forms of savings, family savings, land, gold, what have you, to try to save for the future. And in that context, you can see where, especially in a country that has very recent experience with poverty, the concern with potentially falling back into that could be very real.
Yeah, just to add to this a little bit, like so I was interested in a different piece of that question, which is I had been looking at growing environmental consciousness in Vietnam and had watched more people cite environmental issues over time. And in fact, with Quang Nguyen from the University of Bern had actually done a paper on that trade-off between citizens' environmental interests and their economic interests. But and it had been growing up to a point that it was actually the third or fourth highest issue, maybe the third issue, at like 14% of the population citing it. But then COVID really changed that. Like it dropped after COVID and it has not recovered to the levels it was before. And I really, what I think happened is that, and this is something that other people like Anirudh Krishna is a great scholar of poverty, and it's not just about getting out of poverty. It is about whether you live in a precarious position where an emergency might send you back into poverty, like a health issue or a family crisis that I think might be driving that. And I think COVID just made that very salient for a large number of Vietnamese people, including the large migrant population, the large group of people that are sort of domestic oriented workers population that drove home the questions about poverty. And that spiked again and hasn't come back down again since that period. So maybe as Vietnam's economy settles and continues to grow, we might see it.
Yeah, that's a good point. I hadn't really thought of that. I mean, in some ways, it feels like COVID was 10 years ago already, but it wasn't actually that long ago, and was a huge financial shock to many, many people here. I mean, around the world, obviously, but
so we have people like, I think Paul might, I think the numbers, but it was like 80% of our respondents said that their income was negatively affected as a result of COVID, and a large portion directly lost jobs, like not a trivial portion, directly lost jobs as a result of COVID. So I think the recovery process from it has been much harder than even in a country like Vietnam that handled COVID relatively well compared to the rest of the world.
So starting to move towards a conclusion, I mean, we could definitely talk about this for a few hours, I'm sure, but I want to be cognizant of both your time. If you had to choose, this is kind of a broad question, but one or two your biggest takeaways from the 2023 Poppy, what would they be? I guess, Paul, I'll let you go first.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I think probably the biggest takeaway was just the overall concern with the economy. I think, aside from the index, where I think the transparency declining, as Eddie's already talked about, that was probably one of the biggest shifts in the governance indicators. But I think from the overall survey was just how concerned people are about the economy. It wasn't just so much the people raising it as an issue of important concern, but we saw, since the survey's been going on in 2011 in the whole country, vast majorities of people say that their situation is better than it was 3 or 4 or 5 years ago. And most people express pretty good optimism about the future. Those are still the general sentiments, but they're the lowest levels of positivity that we've seen since we started asking the questions. And for some of these indicators, even as bad as it was during, the height of COVID, those obviously, there was good explanations for why people were concerned about the economy during 2021, 2022. But this year we saw kind of a reversal from even last year's sort of improvement, and then it's kind of declined again to some of the lowest levels of overall positivity. And I think that's something that obviously is very concerning for thinking about the next wave of governance and what the central government needs to be thinking about moving forward. So that was probably the most striking thing that I saw in the 2023 report.
So I have two, I guess. So I have been very interested in the internal migrant population. It's really large. It is growing. And I've been very interested in their experiences when they've moved to new localities, and also trying to sort of figure out who these migrants are and what they're experiencing. And so, I think you can think of the migrant population into three groups. You can think of it as the groups that are moving into the manufacturing sector and industrial zones, and they tend to be, they're younger, they're there for a short time, they tend to be doing kind of all right. And the second group is sort of the college-educated migrants. These are people that came into Hanoi or Ho Chi Minh City for college and then stayed on to work in the professional service sector. And they face some issues as migrants when they don't have household registration certificates in terms of access to services. But there's a third group that which is I would call the migrants that have been pushed out either due to economic issues or due to emerging environmental issues. These migrants tend to be a little bit older, less skilled. They're often working in the sort of the low end service sector. Think like garbage cleanup or hair salons, and they are not doing well in terms of income, in terms of their perceptions of governance. And I'm thinking about that group a lot because something that Paul's worked on, something that I'm becoming more and more interested in is emerging climate migration, Vietnam's experience with it. And I think that group in particular is going to be larger. And I am sort of interested in whether Vietnam is prepared and has the ability to put in place the governance structures and the social structures that are necessary to be able to deal with those emerging shifts, because they're going to be, I think they'll be huge in terms of economic and political changes within the country. So that's the one thing. The second thing that I've been tracking really closely is e-governance. So this part of the report that I worked on this year in terms of, alongside other trends like Vietnam's access to the internet for most citizens has just dramatically risen. And Vietnam's, has large plans to move administrative procedures and access to services online, which I think is all good because it's going to remove bureaucratic discretion, will likely remove informal charges. But the cool thing about Poppy is you can get into the details here, right? So you can see, there are some problems. Most people are accessing the internet on their phones, but most of the systems that they're using are mostly optimized for laptops, right? Like we can see gaps, really interesting gaps in terms of internet access and who are using these procedures that are emerging. And then we can also see, like we've talked about before, still dramatically less people are using these services than you would imagine, given the widespread and wide growth in internet population. So you have so many, like 70% of people or more who access the internet regularly, but you have less than 8% who are actually using these e-governance services right now. And the final thing I'll say on this that I think is a really interesting policy trend is that the halfway house of e-governance is not working. Where you do your procedure, but then you go to pay in person or go to finalize the procedure in person, those people are having way worse experience with governance than those who are doing the entire set of procedures online. And so, and I know there's all sorts of reasons with personal data security and issues that the halfway house is sometimes considered to be the preferable option, but it's definitely is not solving the problems that e-governance is meant to solve. So that's sort of another interesting thing that came out of.
Yeah, all super interesting points. I mean, worth responding to individually, but I think I'll just comment on the migration aspect, which I agree is super interesting and concerning, I think, especially with the Mekong Delta, for example, which has had significant outward migration over the last few years that will certainly continue. And Ho Chi Minh City is the most obvious kind of immediate destination and is already a bit strained and, frankly, kind of overpopulated. It's just so dense, and they're kind of struggling with some of these services already. So that is going to be interesting to watch moving forward. Anyway, I don't want to take up too much more of y'all's time. I know, Paul, it's getting a bit late where you are in Singapore. So thanks so much for coming on. Again, we could have gone for much longer, but I appreciate both of you sharing your insights. So Paul and Eddie, thanks so much for coming on.
Mike, thanks for having us. It's always a pleasure, and keep up the great work that you're doing. You're definitely a resource for so many people that follow Vietnam. So thank you for everything that you do.
Wow, thanks. I appreciate that.
Thanks so much, Michael. Yeah, great pleasure to be here today.
That's it for this week's episode of the Vietnam Weekly podcast. Connect with the Vietnam Weekly on Threads, LinkedIn, or Instagram. Thank you so much for listening, and please rate or review the show on your preferred podcast platform. See you next week.